Thank you, Professor Akoshi, for the introduction. The title of my presentation is The History and Evolution of Japanese Literary Translation in Serbia, as you heard. So it may seem a bit too far-reaching, but seeing as this is, as far as I know, the first of its kind regarding the translation of Japanese literature in Serbia, I had to give some kind of background information as well. So I will be mainly talking about these 3 points. So first, an outline of the history of translation of Japanese literature in Serbia. Second, some sociological viewpoints like visibility and identity. And third, the current problems translators face. So of course, Serbia is not a self-evident term exactly. So the Serbian state has had a turbulent history, some of which you can see here on the slide, and it has often changed its borders and names, and also its definition of a standard language. So until the Yugoslav wars at the end of the 20th century, the standard language was termed Serbo-Croatian. So unfortunately, I don't have the time and space kind of in this presentation to get really into the differences from today's standard Serbian language. But here we won't be including, for example, translators and translations not typically considered Serbian or part of the Serbian standard language. For example, the famous Croatian Japanologist Deviden, Croatian translations of contemporary literature, etc. So here is the number of translations by year. I've counted 166 unique translations in total. This is, of course, not counting reprints and such. And we can see that it's steadily rising. So the number gets a bit smaller at the end, but this is because 2025 is not over yet. We have a big book fair incoming. So now this is the number of direct versus indirect translations by year. So in other words, this marks whether they're from Japanese or a different language. So typically English, German, we also have French or Russian. So direct is on the left, indirect on the right. Now you can see that indirect translations, while in recent years they're fewer in number than direct ones, they're not necessarily decreasing. So we don't see a pattern of direct translations only rising while indirect only fall. So in fact, both are rising. And this fact will be kind of important later. So I have of course, only provisionally tried to divide the history of Japanese literature translation in Serbia into 3 phases. So we have phase 1, during which we kind of completely relied on such indirect translations. So the first translation of Japanese literature into Serbian was the anthology Classical Japanese Poetry from 1928 by the famous poet and writer Miloš Crnjanski, and this was done via French. So Japanese poetry greatly influenced Crnjanski himself, and some other famous writers also joined the discourse on Japanese literature in Yugoslavia at that time, like Isidora Sekulić, and also the Nobel Prize winner, Ivo Andrić, but this is unfortunately interrupted by World War II. So the first translation after the war is a short abridgment of Whaley's Genji in 1955. So you have other authors soon after, Soseki, Akutagawa, Mishima as well, but they're all indirect translations. So now we have phase 2. So this is actually the phase in which Yugoslavian Japanology was founded. So Dejan Razić, he was the first Yugoslavian Japanologist. He was born in Serbia, but he studied in the UK, Australia, and Japan. He went to Waseda Daigaku before returning to Yugoslavia in 1971. And he was also, by the way, the founder of Yugoslavian Sinology as well. So he was a sinologist, not only a Japanologist. And the University of Belgrade first started offering Japanese in 1976. So his first translations were some Japanese fairy tales, but they are soon followed by translations from various writers. We have Kawabata Mishima, Ibuse Masuji Shiganaoya, also some Ihara Saikaku. So he was quite the versed translator. So these Razic's translations are actually the first translations into Serbian from the Japanese original. So his translations continue to be published posthumously until 1994. And then we have phase 3, which is kind of hard to define because it is still lasting, of course. So you can take this with a grain of salt, of course. So Razic's successors and co-workers continue his legacy. So, for example, translators such as Hiroshi Yamasaki-Vukelić and Kayoko Yamasaki, they contributed to the canon of Japanese literature in Serbian, with translations such as the Kojiki and also an abridgment of the Mayoshu, etc. So during the Yugoslav wars from 1991 to 2001, we had the almost complete breakdown of the Yugoslavian publishing system. So many of the biggest publishers of Japanese literature disappeared. But in spite of that, Japanese literature has shown an enduring popularity in Serbia. So new publishers have taken over. It's not a unipolar system, so it's centered on Crnjanski or Razić only. So many new translators take the stage, and both modern and contemporary and also classical works are translated. So that was the kind of chronology. So now from the viewpoint of the sociology of translators, the first thing I would like to kind of talk about is invisibility. So I'm, of course, only repeating what's very well known, that invisibility was long presented as an ideal in translation studies. So, for example, we, of course, have Eugene Nida saying that the human translator is not a machine. He inevitably leaves the stamp of his own personality. He must exert every effort to reduce to a minimum any intrusion of himself. And then, of course, we have Lawrence Venuti. He was also mentioned today. His classic research on the English publishing market. But Venuti is critical towards the praxis of the translator remaining invisible. So he's also a bit critical of Nida's research, etc. So he says, for example, the translator's invisibility is a weird self-annihilation, way of conceiving and practicing translation that undoubtedly reinforces its marginal status in British and American cultures. So, of course, in recent years, we have had advocates for humanization of the research on translation history, particularly by Anthony Pym. And, of course, the founding of literary translator, so not translation studies. Now, how has translators' visibility been achieved so far, at least, of course, when it comes to translating Japanese literature? I will be talking in the context of Japanese literature translation only in the English and Serbian languages, since I'm not familiar with how visibility has operated in other regions, but I'm open to all sorts of comments and counter arguments, which I'm sure are possible. So in my view, visibility of Japanese literature translations in the English language, at least, has been a visibility by excellence, and more so in recent years, of course, as the number of translators increases. So what do I mean by this? By this, I mean that there are many contending translators of Japanese literature, and that the name of the translator may affect our decision whether to read or not to read that translation. So, for example, somebody may choose Burton Watson's translations because he's easy to understand, or when they want to read Dazai's Ningen Shikaku, they have 3 different versions. When they want to read Genji Monogatari, they have 4 different versions, etc., etc. So, however, because of the scarcity of Japanese language translators in Serbia, we have had something different, and this is what I'm kind of provisionally calling a visibility by fact. So all the way up to the beginning of this kind of third phase in Serbia, that is the 2010s, the translator could not remain invisible. So the very act of translating from the Japanese original put him in a different category. So at least this goes for the second and third phase, while Crnjanski was, of course, visible because he was the first in general. So works by that translator would not be sought after because of a certain style or a certain quirk, but because of the very fact that they were direct translations. So Razić and the Yamasaki couple, they were, and they all are culturally significant figures. And only in the past decade have we had the emergence of the quote-unquote invisible translator from the original, which kind of falls in line with American publishing customs, but more on that later. So I mentioned that Japanese language translators in Serbia, they are scarce, so there's few in number. So due to this scarcity, we have had a phenomenon of which I have not yet heard in the English-speaking regions, and that is what I call the Japanese adjacent translator. So what is this? By this I mean a translator who, one, does not know Japanese and translates from a different language, typically English, but is employed more than once to produce indirect translations because of their real or perceived knowledge of Japanese culture, and because employing a Japanese language translator would be expensive or time-consuming, or both. So we have had one particularly conspicuous Japanese adjacent translator, Voja Cholanovic. He was a translator from English, an author, a critic. So he not only translated Akutagawa and certain Japanese myths and legends, but he also authored many articles on Japanese literature and even critiques on other indirect translations. So we have kind of a recursion going on here. So he's by no means a unique phenomenon, and Japanese adjacent translators appear even in today's market, uh, even though Wojciech passed away in 2014. So that is part of the reason why, as I mentioned before, indirect translations, they still contribute to the number of total Japanese literature translations in the present Serbian market. So that was kind of about visibility, and identity is also another important sociological viewpoint I would like to discuss. So, of course, identity is very hard to define in a precise way. I will not be able to give the entire outline of identity studies. So if we go purely by dictionary definition, it can be the distinguishing character of personality, individuality. But of course, in identity studies, there are problems such as frequent confusion between the terms identity, self, and subjectivity, the tendency to take a shallow approach, and many new approaches have been poorly treated in literature, etc., etc. So, of course, what we are most interested about here is occupational identity. So the identity of a translator as it relates to their profession. So, for example, Christensen's 1999 paper is, I think, seminal, and he makes many important points. So, for example, occupation is key to maintaining an identity, not being just a person, but being a particular person. Or, for example, it is societal. It is negotiated with society. It differs from the term self-concept because it is formed through our relationships. And third, it is central in our self-narrative. So that gives meaning for our life itself. So particularly in the terms of the identity of a translator, we've had, for example, the important volume Identity and Status in the Translational Professions. It focuses on the social formation of translators and interpreters also as a specific occupational group and more. However, and this is a big however, a big but for me, so it is important to state, both Christensen and the studies in the aforementioned volume, they treat translation as a main identity. So it is treated as something that many people do during large parts of their lives, or something that is a daily occupation, so something you do every day. So when we talk about the translation of Japanese literature in Serbia, can we talk about the translator's identity? So I think not. So based on the data I've gathered, the average number of translations done by somebody who has translated Japanese literature into Serbian is only 3.5, while the median is actually even smaller. It is only 2. So these are very low numbers. Can we call someone who has translated only a few works but normally does something else a translator of Japanese literature? Of course, that depends on our definition of the word translator. So Andrew Chesterman makes this useful, I think, distinction. So a translator who is someone who does translation regularly and someone who does translation sometimes. So unfortunately, he does not give this second category a specific name. I've been unable to come up with something new. So it turns out that in the Serbian context, if we call translator a label or an act, then yes, there are translators of Japanese literature in Serbia. But if you try to analyze it from the standpoint of current sociological literature on translators, then there are no translators of Japanese literature in Serbia. So we kind of have a Schrodinger's cat. So at least in the terms of defining a social habitus, one's primary identity, one's daily occupation, as Christensen calls it, translator of Japanese literature has not become an occupational identity in Serbia, and it is difficult to analyze it as such. So in other words, everyone who has translated Japanese literature thus far into Serbian has had a different primary identity. So this is, of course, as I've shown on the slide, it is the result of Serbia being a very small market in and by itself. So we only have a population of 6.6 million. And it is impossible for translation of Japanese literature to be one's primary source of income, and let alone the only source of income. So, for example, here is some data. It's on the publishing market from 2022. That was the most recent I was able to find. This is from the Statistical Office of the Republic of Serbia. So the total number of books published was around 12,000. Well, around 5,000 belong to literature. So with the translation data as compared, there were 10 translations of Japanese literature in 2022. 5 were from the original, 5 were not. Out of those 5 from the original, 3 were done by one translator and 1 by one each. So now prices for translations, they vary from publisher to publisher, but one of the largest publishers, standard publishers in Serbia, pays around €5 per 1,800 characters for Japanese. So an average 50,000 word novel would be around €800, which is also the average monthly pay in Serbia. So the translators were able to earn for about 1 to 3 months from translations, which is only a small part of their income. So in other words, I don't think translation of Japanese literature can be called an occupation in Serbia, only an act. So these were some of the sociological viewpoints I talked about, and in the end, of course, I would like to talk about some problems as seen by me. Those who, of course, problems those who translate Japanese literature in Serbia they face today. So the first, it of course has to do it has to also do with visibility, and that is listing translator names on covers. So it is actually extremely rare in Serbia for the name of the translator to make it to the cover, regardless of language. So whether you're translating from Japanese or a European language, French, German, regardless of language. And in this point, the Serbian market differs from both the Japanese and the recent English market. I'm aware that the name is not always listed in English translations, but on the cover. But as far as I've seen, it has become kind of a common practice. Please correct me if I'm wrong. So here you can see a comparison. This is Osamu Daze is, of course, Ningen Shikaku. So the first 2 are the English editions. The third is the Serbian edition from 2021. So in the end, you have space. The publisher inserted kind of a review, but there it seems there wasn't space for the name of the translator. So I personally have been able to agree with, oh yeah, here's another example. So this is a recent one. So Woman of Pleasure by Kayoko Murata. And also we have a review in the Serbian edition, but no name of the translator. So yeah, I personally have been able to agree with 2 of my publishers for my name to be listed, which is what you are seeing right now. But this is, I would say, a rare case. So this was perhaps possible only because the publishers in question are smaller in size. So I was able to have a conversation on a more personal level. But conversely, my translations published from the largest publisher in Serbia, which is Laguna, they do not have my name on the cover. So for example, Murata Kiyoko's Yujoko, so Woman of Pleasure in the English translation. This is my translation, but it doesn't have my name on it. So especially now when translators are not already known, they're not necessarily considered major figures in the cultural life of the country, unlike in the first 2 phases. This becomes, I think, important in ensuring visibility, that is listing translator names on covers. So another one has to do with institutional consecration. Institutional consecration. What I mean is the process by which a translation gains symbolic capital and is confirmed through grants, prizes, and appointments as having true value. So in this, I'm leaning on the 2021 paper by Yvonne Lindquist, who investigated the institutional consecration of Swedish translators. However, the possibility of institutional consecration is absent for translations of Japanese literature in Serbia at this moment. There's only one translation prize, the Miloš Crnjanski prize in Serbia, which is awarded annually. There are no grants. So the prize has never been awarded to a translation of Japanese literature, despite many major works. So institutional consecration is, in my view, important, not because of a prize, but because it is a way for the public to find out about the work, to become aware of it, and for it to be inducted into a canon of sorts. So literary criticism seems to me also one way to kind of consecrate the work, but this too is almost absent in Serbia. So because of this, there is no public discourse which would point out good translations, but also bad ones and set a standard practice. So a possible way to advocate for these changes would be through a translators union. So there is indeed a union of literary translators in Serbia, but it has been completely silent on societal issues such as the above. So seeing as there are at the present moment more translators of Japanese literature in Serbia than ever before, so even of course if they are occasional, perhaps it's the right time to try and form a new kind of translators union. So that would be it for my presentation. Thank you for listening, and I'm open to any questions.